Okay, human biology class, this is the last lecture involving the respiratory system. We're going to look at some ailments that affect the respiratory system. Of course, we're going to look at the coronavirus, COVID-19. Like many conditions, there is the ailment that is caused by a viral infection, and then there is the virus itself. The virus is the severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. The ailment is severe acute respiratory syndrome, and those are sort of official terms for it. So again, we have the virus, and then we have what it does. It's kind of interesting. Some of the tissues involved with corona virus, COVID-19, are tissues we've already talked about or just got done talking about. So I'm not going to give you all the details because what we know is currently evolving. There's a lot of garbage out there. The media seems to be bent on sensationalizing things, creating hysteria so that you're sure to come back and watch. There is reason to be concerned, but there's not reason to be hysterical. And it does look like things are trending in the right direction. We see a number of states opening back up. However, today, the WHO, the World Health Organization, just issued a warning that they're worried that next winter could see a worse outbreak. So the hope right now is to come up with a vaccine, like the flu shot, that carries antibodies that carries the antigens that allow our bodies to make antibodies that would be able to detect and fight off the coronavirus before it created symptoms. That's the goal. That's the gold standard. And it seems like we're making real progress. There are a number of those vaccines being tested right now, both in this country and in other countries. Okay, so again, my wife is a nurse on a respiratory floor. They are a COVID rule-out hospital, which means somebody that is suspected of having the coronavirus ailment or an infection comes to her hospital, comes to her floor. They test them to see whether or not they have it. If they test positive, they are transferred to another hospital, Bethesda, that is solely dedicated to treating coronavirus infections. And so it's interesting to hear my wife talk. They currently have adequate equipment. Always you can have more. They are receiving some mixed signals over whether or not they should be using airborne protocols or droplet protocols. Airborne protocols means that the virus is airborne and can be transmitted easily through the air. Droplet means it has to be carried on a droplet like a sneeze or a cough. There isn't clear evidence yet, one way or the other. It does seem to be that this is a small enough virus that it's largely transmitted on droplets, but can be very small and so can go a bit of a ways. So they're using some airborne precautions too. An example of an airborne virus would be like measles, for instance. That's a virus that can be transmitted a long way just through the air. Well, the coronavirus doesn't go a long way, but it does seem like it can go a ways. And current research suggests that maximum of 4 meters and more likely 2 meters or 6 feet is what's possible with this virus. Beyond that, not likely. Research indicates that it can linger for 3 days on some surfaces. I believe plastics and irons or steels are ones that it can linger on longer. Copper is a natural antibiotic, so it does not linger long on copper. And so it's variable in that regard, but this concept that when you're walking down a staircase and you slide your hand down that stair rail, you're scooping up everything that people have put on there before you. That's why it's important to wash your hands frequently and then not to touch your face, because there are many routes that the pathogen can get into your body doing that, not just a coronavirus. So it can linger on surfaces. It can go through the air. It's not a pure airborne pathogen as far as we know at this point, but it can be transmitted through the air. Let's see, what else did I want to say? Remains viable. Just looking at some notes I took down earlier. Oh yeah, that was another important thing. That the transmission is even likely before a person is symptomatic. So a person doesn't have to show symptoms before they can shed viruses. Mostly, the person is most infectious 4 days after they've been infected with the virus themselves. But 2 to 3 days is possible, and 2 to 3 days before they show symptoms, they're shedding viruses. So the person gets the virus in the body. Their body's trying to fight, trying to recognize it, trying to fight it off, and initially it's losing that battle. And so, probably 4 days later, 5 days later, the person starts to show symptoms because the virus is kind of winning the battle. Before that, the virus is multiplying rapidly in the person because the person's body has not recognized it yet and produced antibodies to fight it off. So the person is shedding viruses then in that period before they're actually displaying symptoms, before they have the nasty cough, cold, all that goes along with coronavirus. So that's a real big problem. They're tracking down how it developed, and there's still controversy over this. As far as we know, it developed in a bat in China. There seems to be pretty good evidence that a particular type of an anteater called a pangolin was an intermediate host, and from there it jumped to humans. Maybe from the bat to the humans, not quite sure yet, but the bats are involved. It seems like this anteater is involved. There's a lingering rumor that it was a military strain that continually gets denied and supposedly disproven, but that lingers. I don't know. Anyway, so the person gets infected. And what happens then? Well, the virus enters the body, and one of the main ways it enters the body is through the respiratory tract. Once it gets into your lungs, it actually binds to ACE2 receptors. Hopefully you remember ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme. It's what does the conversion of angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2 in the lungs. And in that process, it helps us control our blood pressure. Okay, so what's going on then? Well, whenever there's an enzyme, there has to be a receptor for that enzyme. Well, this virus can bind to that receptor in the lungs and also kidneys, other places in the body, but lungs is the one we're looking at, and enters the body by binding to those ACE receptors. And remember, we talked about ACE before with the lungs. That's how it gets in the body. What happens when it gets in the body? Okay, so here we go. If you remember some images that I showed you before, actually, I'll go back to this one. So here, of course, we have the respiratory system. Here we have the trachea. Here we have the bronchi, bronchioles. And down at the end of those little bronchioles then are the alveoli right here. Okay, and each alveoli, you've got like 600 million alveoli in your body. So there's a lot of these. But there's a capillary bed around each of them. And that is where carbon dioxide gets into the alveoli, and blood leaves the alveoli, or oxygen leaves the alveoli in the blood and gets carried to the tissue. So exchanges of nutrients and waste. I also showed you this picture last time, and I want to key on this area. So I'm going to zoom this up, just zoom up or in on this just a bit here, and now we're not so much interested in, I was going to stay there, okay. We're not so much interested in CO2 and O2 and where they go and everything like that. But let's look at this barrier, this boundary right here. So here's the alveoli, and this is the capillary with the red blood cell in it. And there's this wall between the two. Now, the way coronavirus really affects a person is by causing the person to develop ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome. What goes on there with ARDS is these linings here between the blood vessel and the alveoli swell up. That's what happens when a pathogen gets in there. Your body is going to undertake the inflammatory response in response to that virus, that pathogen, and these tissues will swell up. Well, when they swell up, there is fluid retention in there. Now, it doesn't just cause swelling here in this boundary and make it harder for the oxygen to get, I'll go over to this side, for the oxygen to get from the alveoli into the red blood cell. Well, that's true because this is thicker now, but it also causes fluid to build up in the alveoli itself. And so now the oxygen might be here, there might be fluid between it, and it's even more difficult for the oxygen to get to the red blood cell, to get to your tissues, and your tissues become deprived of oxygen. That's the main piece of acute respiratory distress syndrome. That'll come up again. I know I don't have these terms in your notes. I want you to sort of kind of pay attention to the high points, the highlights, okay? And highlights would be ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome. That's what becomes the problem in a person with coronavirus. Coronavirus came from bats, enters the lungs by binding to ACE receptors. Person is able to transmit the disease before showing symptoms. Those are some of the key points. Okay, so oxygen has a hard time getting in here. The person develops acute respiratory distress syndrome, and so what do you do in response to that? They're having a hard time breathing, having a hard time getting oxygen. That has to be dealt with. Okay, so the person then will likely be put on a ventilator. And back in the day, this is what some areas of our country look like. Yeah, this isn't the first time we've had a pandemic, if you will. This is when polio was a big deal back in the late 40s, early 50s, until a vaccine was discovered for polio. People would be struck down with this virus. In some cases, well, a small percentage of the people that actually got polio became paralyzed, but it was still a lot of people. It was millions of people became paralyzed after having contracted the polio virus, and oftentimes they're children. And the paralysis often affected the nerve that allowed them to breathe. And I have had a person speak to the class that was struck with polio, and he was just walking up the staircase. He knew he was sick, but all of a sudden, boom, it hit him. He just fell down the staircase and had difficulty breathing. They rushed him to the hospital and knew right away what it was. And they put him in what was then called an iron lung. And there were wards of iron lungs filled with children and adults too, but a lot of children. And so what happens here, there's a mirror right here, and the person would spend his or her days just looking in the mirror. Couldn't do anything, couldn't communicate, only could look in the mirror, and was entirely paralyzed. They were breathing using this iron lung, which basically created a negative air pressure that allowed air to flow into their lung, and it was a terribly traumatic time. So this is what ventilators looked like in the 40s. Jump ahead to now. This is what the ventilators that you hear so much press about look like. And really what they're doing is they're not just forcing oxygen in, because that can strain the alveoli. They want to get just enough oxygen in to keep the patient alive and doing okay so that their body can pump that fluid out that ARDS creates. They also will likely paralyze the person's own breathing ability so that the respirator will do it for them. The reason is because the person doesn't like being hooked up to this and will try to breathe on their own, out of sync, if you will, with the respirator. So by paralyzing the person's own breathing apparatus, the respirator can do it all. And that's got to be a little bit unsettling. At any rate, that's kind of where we're currently at with coronavirus. And I know that's not a complete answer. There are many other questions out there. Just be cautious. The Center for Disease Control is a good place to find information. Mayo Clinic has many good sites. Medline has many good sites. Look for responsible sites when getting information on coronavirus. Okay, other ailments that affect the respiratory system. Let's start with asthma. It's a fairly common ailment. 1 in 10 inner city kids have asthma. and it affects generally 3 to 6% of the population, but more inner city kids than anything. There are different forms of it. There are a number of different triggers. Let's talk about what goes on first. This image from your textbook right here is what asthma looks like. Notice these airways, these bronchioles, which are predominantly smooth muscle. They become inflamed and then are triggered to constrict. So both the walls swell up, and then the smooth muscle in them constricts and really makes the airway through the middle very small, and it can close it off almost completely. That's asthma. So the question is, what triggers that response in the body? And triggers can be, well, kind of fairly varied. Allergens can cause an asthma attack. Drugs, a variety of drugs can. Air pollution generally can. Chronic infections can do it. Exercise or stress can do it. When I'm doing my cross-country ski races, if it's a particularly cold day or any winter day and we're doing a long race, we're out there 2, 3, 4 hours, whatever, and breathing hard and breathing in that cold winter air, which is usually pretty dry as well, we can develop what's called skier's hack. And in response to that dry winter air going down our airways, our bronchioles will stimulate a histamine dump in the cells along the airway. And histamine is an inflammatory. Of course, an antihistamine is an anti-inflammatory. We try to take that away. So histamine, carried by basophils, gets dumped into these tissues, and we have trouble breathing, and then pretty soon we have to cough. And you cough almost uncontrollably, and to the point where you can taste blood. It's called skier's hack. It really isn't dangerous. It's kind of scarier than anything, but it is another example of an inflammation of these airways that's like asthma. Let's see. So there's ways to things you can do about this, particularly if you're a parent. Early exposure to farm animals, cats, and even daycare has been shown to result in up to an 80% reduction in the occurrence of asthma. Isn't that interesting? So that would suggest that there is some pathogen or some antigen, some molecule on a cell that your body is responding to and creating the inflammatory reaction along the airways. And so by exposing children to farm animals, cats, daycare early, it seems like they're exposed to that antigen, and somehow their body gets used to it, and then they don't respond more dramatically later and develop asthma. I don't know, but that seems some part of that seems to be at play here. The next one is COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or disorder, depending on who you talk to. I'm wondering if you know somebody that is very old and still smokes. I had a great aunt that was 104 and smoked every day when she died at 104. I also had a grandpa that died at 79 and he smoked every day. What's the difference, you know? And I'm guessing you might know some people like that too. Well, there can be lots of things. First of all, smokers, people with chronic bronchitis, chronic inflammation and mucus production along the airways like you see here, can develop COPD. Smokers, though, it's emphysema. That's what really causes the problems. And if you look at the alveoli right here, what this is attempting to show you is a breakdown of the wall between any two bordering or neighboring alveoli. And it makes the cluster of alveoli sort of break down into one big alveolus. And so you lose surface area there, and the gas exchange is inhibited. Now, one of the reasons some people can get away with smoking for a long time is because their body produces a hormone called alpha antitrypsin, and it prevents your body from producing, or it prevents an enzyme that your body produces from working. That enzyme is called elastase. Okay, elastase will break down these walls between the alveoli. That makes them non-elastic, like its name would suggest. And smoking does that. But if you are a person that produces alpha antitrypsin, then that will inhibit elastase from working, and you'll live longer as a result of that. So that's a big piece of what goes into some people living a long time and still being able to smoke. But don't depend on being able to do that. And of course, marijuana, just as bad or worse than tobacco smoke. Vaping can be too. Vaping also has been shown to stimulate a lung infection. That's what a lot of the people that were vaping marijuana that got sick and died from doing that. That's what they were introducing into their lungs. Your lungs aren't built to be sucking in that much toxin, that much cigarette smoke, marijuana smoke, or whatever. That's just not a good thing. Couple more, cystic fibrosis. This is a genetic disorder. It's called, the white plague is what it used to be called. This is an ailment chiefly of Caucasians, people of European descent. 1 in 25 people in the U.S. of European descent carry one gene for cystic fibrosis. For this disease, you typically need 2 genes. Now, what this results in is a malformed gene that causes the mucus to be too thick in your airway, and that makes your airway smaller and catchy. It causes you to have difficulty breathing, and you get frequent infections from this. And really, if you get down to it, the cells affected by cystic fibrosis don't pump chlorine or water out effectively, so the mucus really becomes quite thick. And then the cells surrounding the airway become problematic, and they break down, and it's just generally a nasty condition. You say, well, if it's a problematic gene, why can't they just put the right gene in a person? Well, they've tried that, and so when you insert the right gene into the lungs for the development of this inner lung tissue, the cells might not take it up, and if they do take it up, they might not express that gene. Remember, your genome, your genes aren't all that you are. They're not even, there's a lot more importance in the regulation of those genes, the turning on of those genes. How do you get that to happen? Researchers discovered that when people attempted to transplant the correct gene into lung tissue, that the cells involved might reject it and dump the cells that it got into, basically kill off those cells, dump the DNA from those cells into the lungs, and create an even thicker mucus. So it could be even a bigger problem before the gene therapy than afterwards. And they actually used a virus to attach that gene to, because remember how viruses work. They go into your body, they insert their RNA into healthy cells and cause those healthy cells to start producing viral genes. That's what the coronavirus is doing. Okay, remember it's getting in through that ACE inhibitor molecule, or the molecule that recognizes it. So anyway, cystic fibrosis, they tried to get the gene in by attaching it to a virus, which went into the lung, didn't affect the lung, this particular virus, but it did insert the gene in, but that wasn't entirely effective. So that's too bad. I'm betting some of you know somebody with cystic fibrosis, and they're constantly having difficulty breathing, having trouble with an inflamed and obstructed airway, and life expectancy is not great. It's risen. You'll now see people that live into their 40s, 50s, and beyond with it. But it used to be, your early 20s, and you may even know somebody that didn't live past their late teens or early 20s because of the chronic infection that would come along with this particular disease. Interestingly enough, much like sickle cell anemia, the heterozygous, that means a person has just one gene for sickle cell anemia. So they don't have sickle cell anemia, but they do have the trait. But what that resulted in was a resistance to malaria without them actually having sickle cell anemia. Well, similarly, with cystic fibrosis, we see that if a person has just one gene for cystic fibrosis, they won't develop the disease. But that will give them a resistance to the last disease we're talking about, and that is tuberculosis. So interesting. Again, there seems to be an adaptation there where the human body is using one gene and creating a resistance to a common bacteria. The problem is if you get both genes, then you get cystic fibrosis. Okay, so the last one we're going to talk about is tuberculosis. Pulmonary tuberculosis, that's right here. These are tubercles. They're a little growth that your body builds around an invading bacterium. When I say tuberculosis, there's a lot of characters in history that maybe could come to mind, and I'm just gonna highlight one. This is the Earp brothers and Wyatt Morgan and company, and their buddy Doc Holliday, and this is Doc Holliday right here. If we look at an up-close picture of Doc Holliday, well, first of all, he's a little bit slight of build there, and that's common for cystic fibrosis sufferers, or tuberculosis sufferers, I'm sorry. This is a look at Doc Holliday. Married a lady. Says his wife's name was Big Nose Kate. That just, I don't know, I got a problem with that. Doesn't seem like the best thing. He was a tuberculosis sufferer. Back at the turn of the century, Doc Holliday only lived, I think it was 1881. He lived to be 36 years old and died of tuberculosis. This was the #1 killer of people worldwide at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, in the Victorian era, if you will. It was a big deal. Currently, it's the #2 killer worldwide, and the problem is because it has developed an antibiotic resistance. Another problem with tuberculosis is that it is a true airborne bacterium. It's blowing around, people cough, and it can float on the air. It can live outside the body for weeks, and it's a big issue. This antibiotic resistance, in other words, the standard antibiotics that used to be used to kill off tuberculosis are no longer working on it. 33% of new cases are antibiotic resistance. I think that might even gone up. And if a person has it, there's a 50% mortality. My wife had a patient that had this antibiotic resistant tuberculosis. Was in her hospital for a couple of months. And I got to know him really well. They finally found an antibiotic that was having effect, seemed to effectively treat his resistant TB, and he was discharged from the hospital after a couple months. The problem is he came back in, I think a week or two later, blind and deaf. The problem was that the antibiotic that they used to kill off the bacteria was so severe that it caused blindness and deafness in him. And they didn't know that would happen. They knew it was a possible side effect, but unfortunately it was the case. And they all talked about, would it be better to walk around through life with a mask on or be blind and deaf? And we're all learning what that might be. Okay, so those are some conditions that affect the respiratory system. Again, try to just go over the high points, the emphasized points with each of these as far as what I might ask on the final exam. That's the sort of thing. If you have specific questions, don't forget the forum is a good place to ask them. I will check that periodically, and have a good day.